Thanks, Josh, and good evening, and welcome to MassDEP's third virtual community meeting on the Massachusetts Clean Heat Standard. I am Christine Kirby. I am the MassDEP Assistant Commissioner of the Bureau of Air and Waste. And joining me today from the agency are Will Space, Emily Lamb, and Josh Cook of BAW's Climate Strategies Group. I'll now turn to Emily, and Emily will cover the meeting logistics. Emily?
Thanks, Christine. As Josh said, this meeting is being recorded. We've also muted all attendees to minimize background noise. And we'd ask that if you haven't already, if you please enter your name and affiliation if relevant in the participants panel. You can do that by clicking on the participants icon, and then next to your name, there's 3 little dots that you can click on and choose to rename yourself. Next slide. So there will be opportunities to ask questions and provide comments primarily at the end of the meeting. If you'd like to do that, you can raise your hand. Again, you do this in the participants panel. There's a raise hand button at the bottom, and you'll see that your hand is raised, and there's a little blue hand next to it. When it's your turn, we'll ask you to unmute yourself, and you can make your comment or question. You can also submit questions through the question and answer function. And then I'll turn it back to Christine.
Thanks, Emily. So in terms of the agenda and the meeting tonight, after a review of the Clean Heat Standard background, we're going to provide an overview of our recent technical sessions, and those sessions were held on July 24th, 25th, and 26th. We've had really great turnout, and we appreciate that. It's really important as part of this process to get robust stakeholder input. So as part of the meeting tonight, we will also cover the written comments that we've received on the technical topics, as well as the comments that have been raised on the calls, including those technical sessions that I just mentioned. And before we get to that, we'll provide some background and updates on the Clean Heat Standard process. And like all of our other meetings, we will leave plenty of time for your questions and your comments, which again are very important for us to be hearing from you as important stakeholders. So now I'll turn it over to Will.
Great, thanks, Emily, Josh, and Christine, and everyone for joining. Going to start, as Christine said, just by running over, kind of updating and reviewing some of the material we've started each of our past meetings with. These evening meetings particularly are once every 4 to 6 weeks, so we don't expect you to follow everything or remember everything, and we want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page to start. So this is a virtual community meeting. The idea is that the content is for a general audience, and we have lots of time for questions as comments, as Christine mentioned. And we are following up from technical sessions we've had, and we want to confirm and remind you that we're happy to have email questions, suggestions, or comments anytime at our climate.strategies email address to really make the stakeholder process work as well as it can for everyone. Next slide. So in order to really follow along what we're talking about here, it's important to understand a basic concept of what the Clean Heat Standard concept is. We've went over this in a couple of meetings, and you may want to go back and look at some of the recordings, but just very briefly, talking about a regulation on companies that provide heating energy, like heating oil, natural gas, maybe electricity, to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And the way we would demonstrate that is by using what we're calling clean heat credits. The idea of a clean heat credit is to have a regulation or a standard. We need to really count things in an orderly way so we can set a requirement. So the clean heat credit concept kind of takes all the different concepts of clean heat and it converts it into one sort of accounting mechanism of these credits. And we're looking for input on all aspects of the design of this program. Next slide. So lots of stuff posted on our webpage for various audiences. We do have a 2-page summary of what a clean heat standard is, kind of a little more words on what I just described, that's translated into multiple languages, and that translation is updated since the last meeting we had. There's also a short video to accompany that 2-page summary. We have some quite technical white papers on various technical aspects of the clean heat standard around crediting and compliance. We have documents showing the hundreds of pages of comments we got earlier this year and a brief summary of those comments. And then finally, we have the slides and videos from the past meetings. And particularly important for this meeting is the videos from the technical sessions that we had in July, because we had some longer meetings, as I'll talk about in a minute, in July that we're going to summarize briefly here. But if those are really your areas of interest and you missed those meetings, you may want to go back and look at those videos. So this is all on our Clean Heat Standard webpage, kind of a one-stop place you can find this information. Next slide. So this is not changed from the last meeting. We're looking at just to orient you around the process here. We have set a kind of informal deadline to wrap up our first round of comments, including earlier comments on our discussion document and also anything more recent on the technical sessions and equity mechanisms that we presented in July. So we've already gotten a round of written comments. We posted a discussion document, but at that time we hadn't really done much explaining of what we were talking about. So since that time we've done these online sessions and published some additional materials, and we want to give another opportunity for comment. So if you already submitted comments and you're good with what you submitted, you don't need to worry about that deadline. But if there's something more you want to say, great to get us by September 1st. Not a hard deadline. If you have trouble meeting that, you can let us know that something is coming. But that's kind of when we'd like to get these comments to help us think about next steps. So any next steps we do, we'd want more stakeholder feedback. And then certainly even after that, there need to be regulations. And so we think we're at the stage with fuel supplier reporting regulations that we floated earlier this year to actually make a formal regulatory proposal later this year. We're also working on an early action crediting concept for electrification projects. The fuel supplier reporting would get at, for example, changes in the fuels like biofuels, but we really are focused here on electrification. So we want to use that early action concept to make sure that people that want to get started with qualifying a project for Clean Heat Standard can have the framework to get started. And then finally, we would go further than we've gone in the discussion document in our past meetings and publish what we call a straw program design framework, where instead of asking questions, we'd sort of lay out where we think we might head with program design, for further feedback. So stakeholders, some of them have indicated it's a little challenging to give a lot of detailed feedback when we don't have a proposal out there. So this would sort of address that problem later this year. So those are the next steps that we're thinking of. I think I'm going to hold all the questions till the end of this session because we don't have a lot of material to reference. So I think, Emily, if we go on to the next slide rather. So the main bulk of this meeting, we want to spend reviewing the Clean Heat Standard technical sessions. We obviously can't go all through the content of all those sessions, but we wanted to sort of let people know what was in those sessions, and that might inspire a few things. First of all, it may just be helpful as it's presented. Also might clarify some questions that you'd like to answer later in this meeting or ask later in this meeting, or might suggest to you some parts of the videos that we have posted that you wanted to go back and look at more closely, or other aspects of considering how to comment or just ask about this program. So I'm going to follow the basic concept or content approach we took at those meetings, which is for each of the topics of the meetings, we first, and really I first laid out kind of some background on what we had said as an agency and other parts of state government and other documents that said about a clean heat standard before the first round of comments. And then Emily is gonna jump in and talk about the written comments we received earlier this year, and also comments, the feedback, or at least the topics we talked about in those stakeholder meetings. So so that's going to be sort of the format of our update. I'm going to dive into that now. Next slide. So the first of the meetings we held was focused on the topic of compliance, flexibility in banking, and then the related topic of alternative compliance payments. The topics of these meetings were actually requested specifically by stakeholders. So we thought these were topics that we'd get some lively discussion on based on that request, and we have had some good discussion there. But we didn't, just to be clear, we really followed the lead of the comments on what to talk about at these sessions. So for the first session, we combined a couple of topics that stakeholders asked for. If we move on to the next slide, the general topic of compliance flexibility is something we talked about in our stakeholder discussion document as something that helps to limit compliance costs. For example, if there's something that affects the supply and demand of clean heat, that can help to be addressed by compliance flexibility. And also there's a particular area of variability related to heat, which is the weather is different every winter. That's a little different than, for example, the transportation emissions, which vary a little bit less from year to year. So the stakeholder discussion document laid out a few basic ideas around the credit markets, including flexibility around transferring credits, and also what we call banking and borrowing credits or multi-year compliance periods to address some flexibility around the supply from year to year. We also focused a little more on one of the particular options. We got more stakeholder support and sort of signals from the other documents that this should be a part of the program, is the idea of an alternative compliance payment. And that's really the idea that instead of purchasing or implementing clean heat or purchasing credits, there's the option of making a payment, which we would then use that funding, MassDEP or the state would use that funding to support clean heat. The idea, the tension there, as the Clean Heat Commission laid out in their final report, is you want to make sure that price, that alternative way of complying, is not so inexpensive that people just choose to do that instead of getting clean heat credits. So you want to make sure there's a incentive to get the clean heat credits. But you also want to set it low enough because it does sort of set the potential cost burden on businesses and ratepayers from the program. So that's a kind of standard part of a variety of these programs, and it's one we're anticipating looking at closely for this program. So Emily, I'll turn it over to you for some summary of the comments and discussion recently.
Great, thanks. So I'll start with what we heard in the written comments, and I'll just re-emphasize what Will mentioned earlier, that this is a very high-level overview of the comments that we received, and there's a lot more nuance in the comments themselves, and they're posted on the website if you'd like to look at them. But generally, the commenters that talked about compliance flexibilities were supportive. So compliance flexibility mechanisms, were supportive of the general concept, as well as credit banking and compliance via various different technologies. There were also commenters that brought up support for multi-year compliance periods, and then a few that raised the concept of credit transfers or credit borrowing as additional compliance flexibility mechanisms. Now we can go to the next slide. So during the technical session itself, we had a discussion of the methodologies that you might use to set the ACP level, so how much an ACP is worth. One concept was using the methodologies in MassSAVE programs, the energy efficiency programs that do have rebates for heat pump installations. And another potential starting point is using the social cost of carbon. There were also questions regarding compliance by small fuel suppliers. And then there was some more general discussion that wasn't necessarily specific to compliance flexibility, but about whether emissions from electricity generation should be considered when calculating credit values or factored into the ACP level, and then general requests for us to release more details as they become available. And I'll pass it back to Will now.
Great, thanks for that summary. So the next session we dealt with had kind of in the background one of the big questions about this program, which what really counts as clean heat. And we received a lot of written comments about that earlier in the year that we briefly summarized in a slide, noting that there's a lot of support for electrification as clean heat, and also a significant amount of support for liquid biofuels as clean heat. There's less support for, but some for other solutions such as renewable natural gas, hydrogen, and also combined heat and power solutions were some others that commenters raised. And that's a question, that's a big question for the program design and the kind of thing we would intend to lay out in the framework discussion later this year. That was sort of very much, although that we presented that background, that was not really the focus of the discussion on the Tuesday, July 27th session. But I wanted to mention that just because we focused on sort of the nuts and bolts of how you might calculate the credits for different technologies. And a particular part of that, and again, these are topics requested by stakeholders, would how we would come up with crediting for hybrid heat systems where there's a home or business that has a electric heat system, but also has a fossil system, either to provide part of the energy or as a backup system. And I don't want to I want to just, maybe I'll say one more time because I have forgotten to mention it once before. These sessions we're summarizing, we don't intend that this presentation really gives you everything in those sessions. We noted on this slide that the recordings are on the webpage, and if you're really interested in the details, you probably would want to look at those reportings and not just rely on this very brief summary. Next slide. So we pointed out that MassDEP needs to kind of say what a credit is worth, what kind of value is assigned to credits. And we kind of floated and discussed two different approaches in the stakeholder discussion document. We're kind of leaning toward the latter of these two approaches, or at least not toward the first one I'm going to describe, but just for why way of background, I'll describe both. One of the possible approaches is the way the California program called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard deals with it, where every different way in which fuel can come into the California transportation system, it's a transportation program, gets a different, or specific anyway, credit value, which is denominated in greenhouse gas emission reduction. So, for example, even the fossil fuels, in this case, gasoline or diesel, might have a different score depending on where or how the oil was produced, whether it's an energy intensive refining process or whether there's carbon capture. And then there's various ways of producing biofuels which use different feedstocks, but also different sources of energy to drive the production and different transportation methods. So California gives sort of each and every one of those options a different score for each different what they call a pathway for producing fuel. We're leaning toward looking at something a little similar, more similar to what's used in a federal program called the Renewable Fuel Standard, where in the case of biofuels, fuels sort of either count or they don't. So they qualify as reducing emissions enough or they don't. But once that qualification happens, they're either a qualified fuel or not. So that we're sort of thinking of that as the yardstick approach, where it's a kind of yes or no qualification, where we might set, and then just, to make the concept real simple, there's a certain amount of emission reductions, maybe on average, that's achieved in a single family home. So if we think about it that way, like one credit is just the amount of emission reductions that's in that average home, and that gives us sort of more of a yardstick where we would qualify things, on that framework and a yes or no sort of thing. We also having said that, though, while we like to keep it simple, we are aware that there's one particular scenario that we do need to address, where a home takes in a heat pump to electrify the home, but retains a fossil or biofuel system as a backup, and we would need to have a method for addressing that as sort of not a full electrification, but still an important part of the program. So we're thinking about that and hearing comments on that. So I think with that, I turn it back over to Emily.
Great. Yeah. So in the written comments, we received a lot of commenters suggesting that we should base credit calculations on pre-established methodologies. The two main methodologies that were referenced in the comments were either the MassSAVE energy efficiency programs or the federal GREET model, which is adapted for the California low carbon fuel standard that Will just talked about. There was also a lot of commentary on whether emissions from electricity generation should be included in the calculations, and then some real detailed technical suggestions about how you might quantify those emissions if you did want to include them in the credit calculations. And now we can go to the next slide to talk about what we heard in the session itself. So during the technical session on these topics, there were questions about how you might implement these different crediting approaches, along with a discussion of methods for how to assess electrification-related emissions from the electricity sector, a discussion of the sort of advantages and disadvantages associated with using the GREET model, and then suggestions for how we might credit hybrid heat systems, depending on what the fuel for that fossil backup system was. And then we also had some suggestions for data resources and analytical resources that we could use to think about grid emissions and hybrid heating system performance. And with that, I'll turn it back to Will.
Great, thanks. So the last session we had, again, these were topics suggested by stakeholders. Coming into this, a lot of stakeholders had really already given this a lot of thought, so they had a lot of ideas about what we might talk about. This one was a little less involved, but involved two topics. One was coordination with the MassSAVE program, which is the basically the state program that's providing rebates and assistance for mostly energy efficiency, but also more recently electrification. And then also the concept of measure verification is sort of a MassSAVE program way of saying that you need to actually confirm that the clean heat that is claimed in a rebating or crediting program actually happened as it is described and met the requirements for the program. Next slide. So again, I'm kind of covering the deep background on this with Emily talking a little more about the comments we've gotten. So just, MassSAVE, the way it describes itself, I just kind of described it from the consumer perspective, where it's the rebates that you might get. It is a collaborative of, under a state law, a collaborative of the utilities in Massachusetts, and historically has been focused on energy efficiency and really helping residents and businesses to make those upgrades. The Massachusetts Commission on Clean Heat final report, noted that MassSAVE is sort of the elephant in the room in this area. They provide most of the funding right now for state programs, not just under energy efficiency, but for building decarbonization in general, and that's funded by the ratepayers of those utilities that are part of MassSAVE. And then finally, the stakeholder discussion document waded a little bit into the technical question of reporting and verification. And a particular area of interest there is the idea of having what we call third parties or other, kind of professional verifiers involved, where that can be an additional sort of a cost, but it can also simplify things and help with administrative burden if you have very competent third parties that are kind of signing off or looking at the projects that have the right experience and expertise. So that's what we said, and then turning back over to Emily for what we've heard.
Sure. So in the written comments, there were sort of two themes about MassSAVE that commenters raised. The first was that we should consider using MassSave's methodologies for evaluating energy savings and benefits associated with clean heat projects. And then a coalition of commenters also identified that MassDEP should try to learn from MassSave's experience in trying to deliver these programs in an equitable manner. And so that we should learn from the existing experience there. In terms of measure verification, the commenters were generally supportive of the concept, and they raised the ideas of using utility data, third-party verifiers or aggregators. They also emphasized the need to consider fraud prevention and consumer privacy, and then talked about the potential need for periodic verification, the administrative burdens of verification, and then what emissions calculations methods you might use in measure verification processes. So now we can go on to the next slide to talk about what we heard in the stakeholder or in the technical session. So we had questions regarding credit ownership, specifically for residential customers and clean heat systems that were installed through the MassSave programs, questions about how the clean heat standard would interact with MassSave, and then DOER's, the Department of Energy Resources Alternative Portfolio Standard, which does have some crediting for things like heat pumps in it already. There were suggestions that we require aggregations within the clean heat standard, that would support streamlining the marketing and reporting parts of the program. And then there was a discussion about how web-enabled monitoring tools might help improve measure verification. And with that, I'll turn it back to Will.
Great, thanks. So that concludes the presentation part of it. Right on time for allow for half an hour of discussion, questions, and comments, and still be done at 7. Want to remind you sort of the primary kind of focus of this meeting is to help, to present what was presented in the technical sessions for a more general audience and take questions and comments and discussion in that spirit. So I would ask people to sort of start with those questions, but we're also open for any questions and comments during this time period, about the clean heat standard, if people have other things not related to that. So I think we're ready for questions or comments, which we can do by speaking or entering in the, I guess, Q&A or chat, one of those.
Yeah, if you'd like to speak, raise your hand and we can ask you to unmute. And if you'd prefer not to speak, you can put your question in the chat and I will read it.
Josh, maybe you should go ahead to the last slide just so people have a chance to ponder that. Questions and comments are certainly not required, but we do really like hearing from people, so we'll wait a little bit longer. But if there are no questions and comments, we can wrap up early, I think. Looks like that may be the case. Christine, you think we should?
Yeah, I think we should probably end. We had over 70 people on earlier today. Maybe that's where we got most of our participants for today. And I know that I see at least one person that was on earlier. So again, we appreciate everybody attending and joining us. And we are very much committed to a robust stakeholder process and hearing from all of our interests and parties out there that are interested in the development of clean heat standard. And we are going to continue to have stakeholder input. We see here the number of ways that we can get our information out and how you can contact us. And one thing that we have repeated is that if you have folks that you think may want to sign up for the email list, please have them do that. And there's the information there. And again, we're posting all of our meetings on the website. You can go back and take a look and review at your convenience. And unless there's any more questions, I think we're done for this session tonight. Guess we'll wait another minute or so. And thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.